Hello and welcome to the San Diego Museum of Art. My name is Bailey Kane and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here, and on behalf of the entire staff, it's our pleasure to welcome you. We are so proud to be announcing a new partnership with San Diego Pride. We had a lot of incredible events planned for you this year that unfortunately had to be temporarily postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the meantime, it's my pleasure to introduce Lucas Perez, the Education and Public Programs Assistant, who will be leading you through a very special tour of some of the pieces in the museum's collection. Enjoy.
Thank you, Bailey, and welcome to Proud Identities, a virtual tour that takes a fresh look at our permanent collections to assemble artworks from around the world and across time that speak to LGBTQ+ identities in art. So what does that mean? It means that we've conducted a thorough re-examination of artworks in our vaults to pull examples by LGBTQ+ identifying artists, but also to look at ancient and pre-modern artworks that depict historical notions of a gender spectrum, queer sexuality, and identity. One place to find early examples of depictions of a gender spectrum, for example, is actually in religious art, and religious iconographies around the world have long made use of androgynous gender cues to communicate the non-binary gender of supernatural beings. Our first stop is in the Gupta Empire, which existed in northwestern India from the 3rd century to 543 of the Common Era. So without further ado, let's do it. Iconographies from religious traditions around the world have long made use of androgynous gender cues to communicate the non-binary gender of supernatural beings. Art that emerges from the Gupta Empire, which existed from the 3rd century to 543 CE in northwestern India, is especially replete with evidence of historical notions of a gender spectrum. Examples like the male and female composite form of Lord Shiva and his consort Parvati represent the essential female nature of the male principle of God and the perfect balance of masculine and feminine energies. Gupta period artists also began depicting the Buddha more androgynously, with sloping shoulders, softened musculature, slender fingers, and a gentle downward gaze that gave the sculptures an aura of meditative tranquility. This style of image making proliferated along the Silk Road as Buddhism spread to East Asia. In Edo period Japan, the cult of youthful male beauty was an important theme in art centered around adolescent boys known as wakashu. Notions regarding the age of consent were very different from our own, and in a period where girls sometimes married as young as age 12, boys were also considered acceptable objects of desire. Popular literature of the time, including the tale of Genji, where a character named Genji is disinherited by his father, the emperor, portray wakashu as both tragic heroes and passionate lovers. Wakashu were also prominently depicted in ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and are often only distinguishable from female figures by their hairstyle of long locks at the ears and a shaved patch atop the head. In kabuki theater, where cross-dressing was routine practice, well-known wakashu roles could be played by actors of any sex. It's this gender fluidity that has some scholars referring to wakashu as Japan's historical third gender. Art history can also teach us a lot about the evolution of gender expression over time and cross-culturally. And in many cases, art is our only window into how fashion, gendered beauty standards, and social norms dictated how people constructed gender performances in the past. The next stop on our tour is in Persia, and it's courtly art. Let's go. Artworks such as this Persian tile present the viewer with historical expressions of gendered beauty that in many cases stand in direct contrast to the standards of today. Art from Iran of the Qajar period, which lasted from 1789 to 1925, often depicts men and women in similar clothing, although with different headgear, and distinctive monobrows, that is, eyebrows that are conjoined with a single line of hair. Qajar women also grew faint mustaches accentuated with mascara, while men, as seen in this charming garden scene, were clean-shaven. There's a lot of speculation about why female facial hair became so desirable and celebrated during this era of Persian history, but it was certainly not the only culture to embrace it. Ancient Greeks, Babylonians, Celts, and Byzantines also adopted this beauty standard, while modern artist Frida Kahlo sported a monobrow as a way of opposing prevailing beauty norms. One of the quirky hallmarks of European infant portraiture from about 1550 to 1900 is depictions of children, regardless of sex, dressed in little gowns that only varied slightly between boys and girls. The practice was more a result of practicality than a statement of sex or gender expression. as this style of garment made it easier to care for children who hadn't yet been toilet trained. Young boys stopped wearing dresses after a breaching rite of passage ceremony when they first were allowed to wear pants or breeches. In this portrait, Prince Chigi of Rome is wearing a coral necklace and matching bracelets, meant to protect him from illnesses like smallpox. This image is a fascinating example of how clothing and accessories as indicators of gender expression have evolved over time. The arts have always been a traditional safe space for LGBT artists and their art. Societies throughout history have constructed parameters for acceptable homosexual behavior and often depicted homosexuality in their art. Renaissance art is especially replete with examples. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Caravaggio, and Titian are the first openly homosexual artists, as we may call them, whose histories we know today. Our next stop is in Germany and the Northern Renaissance. Let's go. When Albrecht Dürer completed this woodblock print of his friend Ulrich Warnbühler in 1522, the distinction between heterosexuality and homosexuality did not exist. Same-sex relationships between men were considered part of a wider spectrum of male sexuality, although acts now considered to be homosexual and their punishments were popular topics of discourse at the time, especially within the church. Dürer depicted homoerotic content in his artwork throughout his lifetime, and wrote letters to his friend Willibald Pirkheimer, which confirmed the artist's interest in male beauty and same-sex relationships. It's impossible to know whether Dürer was homosexual as we understand it today, or whether his preferences were a result of a culture of learned homosexuality that proliferated among artistic and literary circles of the Renaissance. Dürer's homoerotic art, however, exemplifies the importance of understanding his works within their historical context, free of contemporary definitions of sexuality. Despite a professed opposition to bourgeois conservatism, the early American avant-garde movement was not necessarily accepting of homosexuality. American artists Charles Demuth and Marsden Hartley met in 1907 at a Paris cafe. The two men became lifelong friends and were the two most prominent gay male artists of the early American avant-garde. Despite being a close friend of Demuth, playwright Eugene O'Neill created a character in his play Strange Interlude named Charles Marsden, an amalgam of the two artists' names, whose onstage frustrated sexuality reveals homophobic stereotypes of their day. O'Neill wrote that Charles Marsden is one of those poor devils who spend their lives trying not to discover what sex they belong to. This is but one published example of literary caricatures based on Demuth and Hartley that represent homosexuality as a dysfunction rather than embracing it as a subversive counterculture identity within the avant-garde. Women have always struggled for representation in the arts. Traditionally, women were usually relegated to craft work, and until the 20th century, there were very few women working as professional artists. The modern era saw the emergence of many successful pioneering women in the arts whose work deconstructed social conventions that usually kept women out of the arts. The heyday of modern art was dominated by powerful male painters, while the work of female artists was considered less serious. One artist who broke through these barriers was Georgia O'Keeffe. Let's take a look. The heyday of modern art was dominated by powerful male painters, while the work of female artists was often dismissed as less serious. Georgia O'Keeffe detested the marginalization of her work and strove to have her paintings recognized on their own merits and not as statements on womanhood. When O'Keeffe began painting close-up views of flowers, shocked male art critics and sympathetic feminists both interpreted the paintings as overtly glorifying female anatomy. Ever the independent thinker, O'Keeffe rebuked this misinterpretation in 1943 by saying, "Well, I made you take the time to look at what I saw, and when you took the time to really notice my flower, you hung all your associations with flowers on my flower, and you write about my flower as if I think and see what you think and see of the flower, and I don't." The work of Marie Laurencin was rediscovered in the 1970s by queer art historians interested in her depictions of women and female love, as well as her connections to important early queer feminist groups. Laurencin was profoundly influenced by Natalie Clifford Barney's neo-sapphic salons, where lesbian and bisexual women gathered to express themselves free of predominating patriarchal social conventions. Within her lifetime, however, it was her relationships with powerful male artists that earned her a position among the avant-garde elite of Paris at the turn of the century. After Pablo Picasso introduced L'Arançon to Guillaume Apollinaire, and the two became romantically involved, the great poet described L'Arançon as Our Lady of Cubism. In 1911, L'Arançon was the only woman to exhibit at the Maison des Cubistes alongside Ferdinand Léger and Marcel Duchamp. Despite her elevated status among the male titans of the art world, L'Arançon continued exploring womanhood and queer sexuality in work throughout her life. In 1931, she was a founding member of La Société des Femmes Artistes Modernes, a group that championed female artists active in Paris at the time. And finally, we end in the modern and postmodern era, a period during which the LGBT coalition has achieved many history-changing civil rights victories, including, most importantly, marriage equality. The last two artists in our tour expressed their love openly as an integral part of their identity. Let's take a look. The confidently independent photographer Bernice Abbott was perhaps ahead of her time in her adoption of feminist views. She publicly identified as a lesbian and was open about her 30-year partnership with art critic Elizabeth McClausand in an era where coming out was very rare. Abbott wore slacks and a big overcoat with lots of pockets that she said was more useful for carrying camera supplies and taking photographs than a purse, which got in the way. Changing New York is Abbott's seminal documentary photo series, commissioned by the Federal Arts Project in 1935 to capture the potential of New York City emerging from Depression-era austerities, as expressed in its towering architecture. Abbott never shied away from visiting some of New York's grittier neighborhoods in pursuit of the perfect angle. And when a male editor quipped that, "Nice girls didn't go to such places," Abbott replied, "I'm not a nice girl, I'm a photographer, I go anywhere." Jasper Johns met Robert Rauschenberg in 1953 while they were collaborating on window displays for high-end department stores in New York City. The two artists began painting together, and a romance quickly ensued, during which some of their most iconic artworks were produced, including Rauschenberg's Combine paintings and Johns' Targets and Flags. Together they confected a style of art making that celebrated the banality of everyday objects, as a way of counteracting what they saw as the absurd seriousness of abstract expressionism. The art movement they inspired, sometimes referred to as Neo-Dadaism, would go on to influence the pop art movement, including artists like Andy Warhol. Ultimately, the strain of two successful art careers proved too much for their relationship, and they split in 1959, putting it into one of the most important artist romances in modern art. Although the two artists are now good friends. Well, that concludes our video tour. We hope that you learned a little about LGBTQ+ art history and about some of the artworks in our permanent collection that document the evolution of proud identities. As a reminder, it's always better to see art in person. A picture or a video never really fully captures the materiality of an artwork. So we hope to see you soon in one of our galleries, and until then, thank you and happy Pride. Rebecca and I really hope you enjoyed that video. Please join us after the credits for a live Q&A and discussion about Proud Identities, SDMA, and San Diego Pride. Lastly, please remember to subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel, hit notifications, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.